Revenge isn't a dish best served cold. It's best served under the blinding glow of 1,000 baccarat crystal chandeliers, surrounded by the city's most ruthless elite, with a flute of vintage Dom Perignon in hand. When a man believes he has utterly destroyed a woman, he forgets one crucial rule. The woman who built his empire knows exactly where the structural flaws are. Tonight, one arrogant billionaire is walking straight into a trap dressed in a bespoke tuxedo, with his downfall clinging to his arm. In the ultra-exclusive echelons of Manhattan's high society, the name Richard Crawford was synonymous with aggressive success. As the CEO of Crawford Wealth Management, Richard was the golden boy of Wall Street, a man who graced the cover of Forbes and whose aggressive hedge fund strategies were discussed in hushed, reverent tones at the Harvard Club. But those who truly understood the architecture of power in New York knew that Richard's empire was held together by the quiet, relentless brilliance of his wife Victoria. For 10 years, Victoria was the ultimate power behind the throne. She wasn't just a trophy wife. She was a master strategist, an Oxford-educated public relations savant who had sacrificed her own burgeoning agency to meticulously curate Richard's image. When he was accused of insider trading early in his career, it was Victoria who managed the crisis, dining with editors at the New York Times and turning a potential scandal into a narrative of corporate victimization and ultimate triumph. She orchestrated the charity dinners, charmed the Saudi investors, and handpicked the board members. She built the man. And how did Richard repay her? By serving her divorce papers on her 35th birthday, right in the middle of a private lunch at Le Bernardin. The memory still tasted like ash in Victoria's mouth. She remembered the exact moment the courier approached their table. Richard hadn't even had the decency to look her in the eye. He had been swirling his Macallan 25, his eyes fixed on the street outside. "It's not working anymore, Victoria." He had said, his voice as sterile as a corporate boardroom. "You're too intense, too focused on the architecture of our lives. I need someone who actually enjoys the life we've built. Someone who looks at me, not at my schedule." That someone was Chloe Sinclair. Chloe was 23, a former bottle service girl from a high-end meatpacking district club who had recently reinvented herself as an art consultant. She was all gloss and no substance, a walking, talking Instagram filter with a penchant for Van Cleef and Arpels jewelry that Richard happily bankrolled. Victoria had known about the affair for 3 months. She had seen the charges on the Black American Express. She had smelled the sickeningly sweet Maison Francis Kurkdjian perfume on Richard's collar. But she had stayed quiet, assuming it was a midlife cliché he would eventually outgrow. She was wrong. Richard didn't just want an affair. He wanted a total replacement. He wanted a woman who worshipped him without knowing the sacrifices it took to make him a god. The divorce was brutal, swift, and heavily publicized. Richard's lawyers, a ruthless team from a top-tier white shoe firm, exploited a heavily ironclad prenuptial agreement Victoria had signed back when they were just two ambitious kids with nothing to lose. Because Victoria had officially been a stay-at-home spouse on paper, despite doing all the unpaid labor of a chief operating officer, she was left with a fraction of the fortune she had helped create. Richard didn't just take the money, he took the social circle. The Hamptons crowd the Upper East Side Gala chairs, the billionaire investors, they all flocked to Richard, the man with the checkbook. Victoria was abruptly uninvited from the Met Gala committee. Her calls to former friends went to voicemail. To add insult to injury, Richard immediately began flaunting Chloe. Page 6 was flooded with photos of the new couple, Richard and Chloe, in St. Bart's. Richard and Chloe shopping at the Cartier flagship on Fifth Avenue. Richard and Chloe laughing on a yacht in Monaco. Chloe even had the audacity to post a TikTok from the master bathroom of the Tribeca penthouse that Victoria had spent 2 years renovating, captioning it, "When he treats you like the queen you are." The humiliation was designed to break Victoria. And for a few dark, suffocating weeks in a rented Brooklyn Heights apartment, it almost did. She spent her days staring at the ceiling, mourning not just the loss of her marriage, but the theft of her life's work. But Victoria was not a woman who shattered. She was a woman who calcified. One rainy Tuesday, as she watched a Bloomberg segment featuring Richard casually taking credit for an international merger she had orchestrated, something inside Victoria snapped. The grief evaporated, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard clarity. Richard thought he had buried her. He didn't realize she was a seed. Revenge Victoria decided could not be messy. It couldn't be a screaming match in a restaurant or a leaked rumor to the tabloids. It had to be a masterclass in psychological warfare. It had to be a public execution of Richard's ego orchestrated so flawlessly that he wouldn't even see the blade drop until his social head was already rolling. To do this, Victoria needed power, and she needed it fast. She reached out to the one person who had never cared about Richard's money, Eleanor Croft. Eleanor was a legend in the European luxury event space, a fiercely independent woman in her 60s who ran Lumiere and Partners, a premier PR and event management firm based in London that catered exclusively to old money and royalty. Eleanor had always seen Victoria's untapped genius, and had frequently lamented that Victoria was wasting her talents playing a supporting role to a Wall Street shark. When Victoria flew to London and walked into Eleanor's Mayfair office, she didn't ask for a job. She asked for an empire. "I have exactly $2 million left from the settlement," Victoria told Eleanor, placing a notoriously thick portfolio on the antique mahogany desk. "I want to buy a 40% stake in Lumiere. In exchange, I will expand the firm into the American market, secure the top-tier New York elite, and within 18 months double your revenue." Eleanor, sipping her Earl Grey tea, looked at the fire in the younger woman's eyes. "You're bleeding, Victoria. Desperation makes for bad business." "I'm not desperate," Victoria replied, her voice ice cold. "I am unburdened. For the first time in 10 years, I am working solely for myself." Eleanor smiled. The deal was struck. Over the next 12 months, Victoria underwent a transformation so absolute it bordered on the supernatural. She dropped her married name, reverting to her maiden name, Victoria Hayes. She dyed her signature blonde hair to a striking, severe raven black. She overhauled her wardrobe, trading the soft, approachable pastels of a hedge fund wife for sharp, structural Tom Ford suits and Alexander McQueen power dresses in monochrome blacks, whites, and deep crimsons. Operating entirely behind the scenes, Victoria launched the New York branch of Lumiere. She worked 20-hour days utilizing every contact she had secretly nurtured over the past decade, because she knew exactly how the billionaires thought she knew exactly how to market to them. Lumiere quickly became the ghost agency for the ultra-rich, the firm you hired when you needed absolute discretion and unparalleled elegance. While Richard was busy dealing with the exhaustion of keeping up with a 23-year-old mistress popping Viagra and desperately trying to understand TikTok algorithms to keep Chloe entertained, Victoria was quietly taking over the city's elite social calendar. Then came the golden opportunity, the Sovereign Winter Gala. It was the most prestigious philanthropic event of the decade, co-hosted by the royal family of a prominent European principality and the United Nations. It was an event where kings mingled with tech billionaires, where billion-dollar mergers were quietly negotiated over caviar, and where social standing was cemented for a generation. It was to be held at the historic Plaza Hotel, completely bought out and redesigned for the evening. The Royal Committee needed an event director. Dozens of agencies pitched. Victoria flew to Geneva, walked into the committee room, and delivered a presentation so flawless, so deeply attuned to the nuances of royal protocol and modern luxury that they handed her the contract on the spot. As the executive producer and host of the Sovereign Winter Gala, Victoria held the keys to the kingdom. She controlled the guest list, the seating chart, the press access, and the narrative. And she knew exactly what Richard needed. Richard's hedge fund was currently bleeding capital. He had made a highly leveraged, arrogant bet on a volatile tech startup that had crashed spectacularly. He desperately needed an influx of foreign capital to stay afloat, specifically from the European aristocrats and sovereign wealth funds that would be attending the Winter Gala. Richard had to be in that room. It wasn't just about social pride anymore. It was about financial survival. Victoria made sure Richard received an invitation, but she didn't send it through the standard mail. She had it hand-delivered to his office via a diplomatic courier embossed with a royal crest, ensuring his ego would be sufficiently stroked. The invitation addressed him and a guest. When Richard received the gold-leafed envelope, he reportedly popped a bottle of Krug in his office. He thought he had made it to the untouchable tier of society. He thought this was his moment to secure the European money and solidify Chloe as his glamorous partner in the eyes of the global elite. He had no idea that the spider had just invited the fly into the web. The night of the Sovereign Winter Gala descended upon Manhattan like a glittering frost. Fifth Avenue was locked down by the NYPD. Black Cadillac Escalades and Maybachs lined up for blocks, inching their way toward the grand entrance of the plaza. The crisp winter air was punctuated by the relentless blinding flashes of hundreds of paparazzi who had been flown in from around the world. Inside the back of his chauffeured Rolls-Royce Phantom, Richard Crawford checked his Rolex Daytona. He felt invincible. He was wearing a custom Brioni tuxedo with a velvet lapel, his silver fox hair perfectly styled. Tonight was the night he would corner the Duke of Valois and secure the nine-figure investment his fund desperately needed. Beside him, Chloe was snapping selfies with the flash on, oblivious to the gravity of the evening. "Babe, look at this lighting, it's giving old Hollywood," Chloe chirped, holding her iPhone high. Richard looked at her and felt a sudden fleeting pang of unease. Chloe was wearing a custom dress from an obscure avant-garde designer she had found on Instagram. It was a sheer neon pink illusion gown, adorned with aggressive ostrich feathers and a slit that rode dangerously high up her hip. It was a dress designed for the MTV Video Music Awards, not a royal philanthropic summit. "Are you sure that's what you want to wear?" Richard had asked earlier in the penthouse, trying to mask his hesitation. "Richard, it's high fashion," Chloe had scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You don't want me looking like one of those stiff, boring Upper East Side mummies, do you? You brought me to make a statement." A statement, Richard thought now, looking at the neon feathers reflecting in the car window. Right. He pushed the doubt away. He was Richard Crawford. He dictated reality. If he walked into that room with Chloe on his arm, the room would have to accept her. That was the nature of power. The Rolls-Royce pulled up to the red carpet. A white-gloved attendant opened the door. The roar of the paparazzi was deafening. "Mr. Crawford over here, who are you wearing?" "Chloe!" the photographers screamed. Richard puffed out his chest, buttoned his jacket, and offered his arm to Chloe. She practically leaped out of the car, striking highly stylized, exaggerated poses that caused a few of the veteran society photographers to lower their cameras in sheer bewilderment. Richard smiled tightly, waving to the crowd playing the part of the benevolent titan. They walked up the grand steps and entered the foyer of the plaza. The transformation of the space was breathtaking. The lobby had been turned into a winter forest of white birch trees intertwined with thousands of real white orchids and baccarat crystal drops. A 50-piece string orchestra played a hauntingly beautiful modern classical piece on a raised balcony. The room was already buzzing with the true masters of the universe. Richard spotted the CEO of Goldman Sachs, a prominent tech billionaire, and 3 members of the British royal family sipping champagne near an ice sculpture of the globe. "Oh my God, I need a picture in front of those trees," Chloe squealed, completely ignoring the solemn elegance of the atmosphere. She dragged Richard by the arm toward the floral arrangement, her neon pink dress clashing violently with the serene white and silver decor. As Richard stood there forcing a smile for Chloe's Instagram story, he began to notice the looks. They weren't looks of envy. They were looks of polite, deeply veiled horror. A prominent French diplomat's wife leaned over to a senator, whispering behind her fan, her eyes locked on Chloe's feather-trimmed neckline. An old-money matriarch from Boston literally turned her back as they approached. Richard felt a prickle of cold sweat on the back of his neck. He was used to commanding respect, to commanding fear. He was not used to being the subject of quiet mockery. "Let's go find our table, Chloe," Richard muttered, grabbing her elbow a little too tightly. "Wait, I haven't tagged the location yet," she protested. "Now, Chloe." They approached the grand mahogany reception desk, where stern-faced attendants in black tie were checking the master list. "Crawford, Richard said smoothly, handing his heavy gold-embossed invitation to the attendant. Richard Crawford and guest. The attendant, a young man with a crisp British accent, typed the name into an iPad. He frowned slightly. Ah, yes, Mr. Crawford. Welcome to the Sovereign Gala. Let me check your seating assignment. The attendant tapped the screen and his polite smile tightened into a mask of professional discomfort. Mr. Crawford, you're seated at table 84. Richard froze. His blood ran cold. Table 84. In high society galas, the room is mapped out with militaristic precision. Tables 1 through 10 are the inner sanctum, the royals, the billionaires, the absolute elite. Tables 11 through 30 are the respected peers. Anything past table 50 was the outer rim. Table 84 was practically in the service corridor. It was the social equivalent of being seated in the restroom. There must be a mistake. Richard said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into his boardroom intimidation tone. I am the CEO of Crawford Capital. I'm supposed to be seated with the Duke of Valois. I assure you, sir, there is no mistake. The attendant replied, completely unfazed by Richard's aggression. The seating chart was meticulously arranged by the host and executive director of the gala. Then get the executive director out here right now. Richard demanded, his face flushing red. Beside him, Chloe was pouting, annoyed that the attention was no longer on her. I don't care who this director is, they clearly don't know who I am. I'll buy this entire hotel and fire them. That won't be necessary, Richard. The voice cut through the noise of the lobby like a finely sharpened scalpel. It was low, melodic, and chillingly familiar. Richard stopped breathing. He turned around slowly, the neon pink feathers of Chloe's dress brushing against his trembling hand. Standing at the top of the grand marble staircase, bathed in the soft, ethereal light of the crystal chandeliers, was Victoria. But it wasn't the Victoria he remembered. The woman standing above him was a goddess of vengeance. She was wearing a breathtaking, custom-made structured gown of midnight blue velvet that absorbed the light dripping in a fortune of vintage Cartier diamonds that sparkled like frozen stars. Her dark hair was slicked back into a severe, elegant knot, exposing the sharp, aristocratic lines of her cheekbones. She held a clipboard encased in black leather in one hand and a flute of champagne in the other. She looked down at him not with anger, but with the cold, detached pity of a scientist observing a dying insect. The lobby suddenly felt very, very quiet. The orchestra seemed to fade into the background. Every eye in the vicinity, the diplomats, the billionaires, the royals, turned to watch the confrontation. Victoria. Richard stammered the name, catching in his throat like broken glass. Victoria descended the stairs with agonizing slowness, her velvet train gliding silently over the marble. She stopped 2 steps above him, forcing him to crane his neck to look at her. Hello, Richard. Victoria said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the silent lobby. I see you brought your accessory. She didn't even look at Chloe. She didn't need to. Her indifference was the ultimate insult. What are you doing here? Richard hissed, trying to regain his composure. How did you get in here? Victoria took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne. A terrifying, beautiful smile touched the corners of her lips. Get in, she repeated softly, her eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. Richard, darling, I didn't just get in. She spread her arms slightly, encompassing the breathtaking ballroom, the orchestra, the royals, the entire empire of the evening. I am the host. The words hung in the chillingly pristine air of the plaza's grand foyer, echoing against the marble pillars. I am the host. Richard stared at Victoria, his mind violently rejecting the information. His jaw slackened, and for a fleeting, pathetic second, the formidable CEO of Crawford Wealth Management looked like a lost little boy. This was impossible. Victoria was a discarded relic, a woman he had relegated to the past, quietly nursing her wounds in a Brooklyn apartment. She was not supposed to be standing before him draped in custom Schiaparelli velvet, wearing a king's ransom of Cartier diamonds, and commanding the most powerful room in the Western Hemisphere. Richard choked out a nervous, entirely unconvincing laugh escaping his lips. You're hosting the Sovereign Gala. Don't be ridiculous, Victoria. What is this, some kind of desperate stunt to get my attention? Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She merely tilted her head, her dark eyes glittering with absolute terrifying authority. Mr. Crawford, she said, using his surname with a surgical coldness that sent a shiver down his spine. I assure you my attention is entirely occupied by people whose net worth isn't currently plummeting. If you have an issue with your seating arrangement, you are more than welcome to surrender your invitations to security and exit through the revolving doors. There's a very eager wait list of junior executives who would kill for your scraps. A few feet away, a recognizable figure, Bernard Arnault, the chairman of LVMH, paused his conversation to watch the exchange, an amused smirk playing on his lips. Richard felt his face burn with the heat of 1,000 suns. The ultimate humiliation in high society isn't anger, it's irrelevance. By threatening to replace him with a junior executive, Victoria was publicly stripping him of his status. Richard, who is this? Chloe whined, tugging on his sleeve. Her neon pink ostrich feathers shook violently. Why is she talking to you like that? Tell them we want a table near the dance floor. Victoria finally let her gaze drop to Chloe. The silence that followed was agonizing. Victoria's eyes slowly scanned the sheer garish dress, the heavy glittering makeup, and the frantic out-of-place energy of the younger woman. It was a look that communicated a novel's worth of disdain in a single devastating second. How quaint, Victoria murmured softly, though the words carried perfectly. You brought a souvenir. Chloe's mouth dropped open in outrage. Excuse me, you? Walk away, Richard. Victoria advised, her tone shifting to one of bored finality. Before you make a scene that permanently blacklists you from every charity board in Manhattan, Table 84, enjoy the evening. She turned her back on them without another word, gliding seamlessly toward a cluster of European diplomats who immediately parted to welcome her into their circle. Richard was paralyzed, caught between the instinct to rage and the terrifying reality of his surroundings. He couldn't scream. He couldn't demand a manager. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, and his ex-wife held the key. Defeated, his shoulders slumping beneath his bespoke tuxedo, he grabbed Chloe's arm and began the longest walk of his life. The grand ballroom of the plaza had been transformed into a breathtaking winter palace. Tables draped in silver-threaded linen were adorned with towering centerpieces of white peonies and crystal candelabras. The room was a sea of old money and new power. But as Richard walked, he realized the geography of the room was designed as a descending hierarchy of worth. They passed Table 1, where the Duke of Valois sat laughing with the British ambassador. They passed Table 10, populated by tech moguls and media barons. They passed Table 30, Table 50, Table 70. The further back they walked, the dimmer the lighting became, and the less recognizable the faces were. Finally, they arrived at Table 84. It was situated practically in the shadows, tucked behind a massive obstructive ice sculpture of a swan, and wedged perilously close to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. The noise of clinking plates and shouting chefs was faintly audible over the string quartet. Richard pulled out a chair and collapsed into it, staring blankly at the silver charger plate in front of him. This is unacceptable, Chloe hissed, slamming her sparkly clutch onto the table. My dress is getting ruined in this draft, and I can't even see the stage. Richard, do something, call someone. Shut up, Chloe. Richard snapped the veneer of the indulgent sugar daddy, finally cracking. Just shut up for 1 minute. Don't you tell me to shut up? She shrieked, drawing the irritated glances of their table mates. Richard looked up, finally taking in the company Victoria had curated for him. Seated directly across from him was Arthur Pendleton, a notoriously aggressive financial journalist for the Wall Street Journal, who had recently written a scathing op-ed questioning the liquidity of Crawford Wealth Management. Arthur raised his glass of champagne in a mocking toast, a predatory grin on his face. Beside Arthur sat Eleanor Croft, Victoria's new business partner, who watched Richard with the serene satisfaction of a lioness watching a wounded gazelle. Victoria hadn't just seated him in the back, she had seated him in a designated kill zone. She had surrounded him with his most dangerous critics and forced him to sit through a 5-course meal of his own irrelevance. Throughout the first course, a delicate white truffle risotto, Richard could do nothing but watch the screens positioned around the room. The cameras continuously panned to Victoria. She was radiant, powerful, and utterly in her element. She clinked glasses with Anna Wintour. She leaned in to whisper a joke to a Vanderbilt. She commanded the room with a grace Richard had never fully appreciated when she was organizing his life. He had traded a queen for a pawn, and the entire kingdom was laughing at him. By the time the main course, a dry-aged Wagyu beef tenderloin with a red wine reduction, was served, Richard's anxiety had morphed into sheer panic. He had barely touched his food. His phone was buzzing incessantly in his pocket, with panicked messages from his chief financial officer. The European markets were opening soon, and rumors about Crawford Wealth's massive, highly leveraged losses in a disastrous biotech startup were beginning to leak. He needed the Duke of Valois. The Duke represented a French sovereign wealth fund that was looking to inject 300 million euros into American assets. If Richard could secure a private meeting tonight, he could save his firm. It was the entire reason he had fought for this invitation. He looked toward table 1. The Duke, a distinguished silver-haired aristocrat named Louis de Bourbon, was deep in conversation. And sitting to his right, radiant and captivating, was Victoria. "I have to do this," Richard thought, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. He couldn't let his ego destroy his company. He stood up, ignoring Chloe's protest that her feet hurt, and she wanted to leave, and began weaving his way through the labyrinth of tables toward the front of the room. The atmosphere grew noticeably more exclusive as he approached the inner circle. The air smelled of expensive perfume and quiet power. Security guards subtly shifted their weight as Richard neared table 1, but Victoria caught his eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod, allowing him to pass. "Your Grace," Richard said, plastering on his most charming, confident Wall Street smile as he reached the table. "Richard Crawford, CEO of Crawford Wealth. It is an absolute honor." The Duke paused, a bite of Wagyu halfway to his mouth. He looked at Richard with mild annoyance, at the interruption, his aristocratic brow furrowing. He glanced at Victoria, silently asking for context. Victoria smiled a warm, dazzling smile that didn't reach her eyes. She placed a gentle, proprietary hand on the Duke's forearm. "Louis, darling." Victoria purred, her voice dripping with lethal sweetness. "Allow me to introduce Richard Crawford. He's a very eager attendee tonight." "Ah," the Duke said smoothly, though his eyes remained cold. "Mr. Crawford, a pleasure. Victoria was just telling me about the incredible resilience of the American market." "Indeed." Richard seized the opening, leaning in aggressively. "In fact, Crawford Wealth is currently positioned to capture massive upside in the next quarter. I would love to arrange a private breakfast with your team tomorrow to discuss a highly lucrative exclusive vehicle we are opening up for European partners, Assarat." "Oh, Richard, you are always working." Victoria interrupted, her voice ringing out just loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding billionaires. "Even when you should be resting, I was just telling Louis how incredibly brave you are being right now." Richard froze. "Brave? Well, yes," Victoria said, adopting an expression of deep, tragic sympathy. "Louis Richard is far too modest. He has been working tirelessly to keep Crawford Wealth afloat after that devastating $400 million write-down in the biotech sector last week. I mean to lose nearly 40% of your flagship fund's liquidity overnight and still have the energy to come to a gala. It's inspiring, really, the sheer willpower to ignore the margin calls." The temperature at table 1 seemed to plummet below freezing. The Duke's fork slowly descended back to his plate. Old money despised 2 things above all else: volatility and desperation. The revelation of a massive, unpublicized loss delivered in public by the host of the most prestigious event of the year was a financial death sentence. A $400 million loss. The Duke repeated, his voice devoid of all warmth, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Richard. I was not aware your flagship fund was experiencing such catastrophic turbulence, Mr. Crawford. Your Grace, it's a temporary restructuring. Richard stammered, the blood draining from his face. He shot a look of pure, unadulterated hatred at Victoria. The media exaggerates these things. We are highly capitalized. Restructuring is always so exhausting. Victoria sighed, taking a delicate sip of her Dom Perignon. Arthur Pendleton from the Journal was just telling me at Table 84 how he's running a front-page exposé on it tomorrow morning. I'm so glad you got to sit with him, Richard. I thought it would give you a chance to get ahead of the PR disaster. The Duke of Valois leaned back in his chair, folding his napkin and placing it deliberately on the table. It was the universal gesture of dismissal. I appreciate your introduction, Mr. Crawford. The Duke set his tone icy enough to freeze the East River. However, my fund's mandate strictly prohibits engaging with entities currently undergoing SEC scrutiny or catastrophic capital hemorrhaging. I wish you the best of luck with your margin calls. Now, if you will excuse us, Victoria and I were discussing the upcoming regatta in Monaco. Richard stood there, completely exposed, his career bleeding out on the plush carpet of the Plaza Hotel. He looked around the immediate vicinity. Several major investors who had been eavesdropping on the conversation were already pulling out their phones, furiously texting their portfolio managers to dump Crawford Capital stock first thing in the morning. He had walked over here hoping to secure a lifeline. Victoria had publicly handed him an anvil and kicked him into the ocean. You planned this. Richard hissed at Victoria, his voice trembling with a terrifying mix of rage and realization. He abandoned all pretense of decorum. You sat me with a journalist. You fed the rumors to the Duke. You set me up. Victoria looked up at him, her expression perfectly serene. The soft glow of the table candles illuminated the sharp, triumphant angle of her jaw. I didn't lose $400 million of client money, Richard. You did, she replied softly, her voice a deadly whisper meant only for him. I didn't abandon a 10-year partnership for a 23-year-old child in neon feathers. You did. I merely created the stage. You are the one who chose to dance on it. She picked up her champagne flute and held it up to him, the baccarat crystal catching the light. To the architecture of our lives, Richard. She smiled. I hope you enjoy the view from the ruins. The walk back from the inner sanctum to Table 84 was the longest, most excruciating pilgrimage of Richard Crawford's life. The plaza's grand ballroom, which moments ago had seemed like a glittering temple of opportunity, had morphed into a gauntlet of quiet condemnation. The soft clinking of fine silver against porcelain felt like the ticking of a metronome counting down to his total destruction. He could feel the eyes of the city's most ruthless predators tracking him. He could hear the faint, venomous whispers rustling through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. The titans of industry, the men he had golfed with in the Hamptons and traded secrets with over rare scotch, were actively pivoting their chairs away from his path. High society operates like a school of sharks. The moment there is a drop of blood in the water, the infected are isolated and devoured. Victoria hadn't just cut him, she had severed his main artery in front of the entire ocean. When Richard finally slumped back into his chair behind the massive mocking ice swan, he was trembling. The bespoke Brioni tuxedo suddenly felt suffocating a tailored straitjacket. He stared blankly at his half-eaten Wagyu beef, his vision swimming. Chloe, completely oblivious to the financial and social guillotine that had just dropped on her boyfriend's neck, was still furiously tapping away on her iPhone, her neon-pink ostrich feathers trembling with irritation. "Did you get us a better table?" she demanded without looking up from her screen. "Because the waiter just ignored me when I asked for more sparkling water. It's like we're completely invisible back here. Did you talk to the European guy, Richard? Hello?" Before Richard could find the air to speak, Arthur Pendleton leaned across the table. The seasoned Wall Street Journal reporter twirled his Mont Blanc pen between his fingers, a smile of pure predatory amusement carved onto his weathered face. Arthur had spent his career tearing down fraudulent titans, but rarely did he get a front row seat to an execution this flawlessly choreographed. I don't think he managed to upgrade your seats, my dear, Arthur said to Chloe, his tone dripping with patronizing sweetness. In fact, I'd wager Richard is currently calculating how he's going to pay for the black car ride home. Chloe paused, her perfectly manicured fingernails hovering over her glowing screen. She blinked at the journalist, her heavily lashed eyes narrowing in confusion. "Excuse me, who are you?" "Arthur Pendleton, Wall Street Journal," he replied, giving a mock salute with his pen. "And I happen to know exactly what Richard was discussing with the Duke. Your boyfriend here just had his flagship hedge fund bleed out $400 million. He's underwater. Margin calls are going to hit his desk by 8 a.m. tomorrow, and by the looks of the panic spreading at Table 1 right now, his limited partners are already drafting their withdrawal notices." Chloe looked from Arthur to Richard. The color drained from her deeply tanned face. "Richard, what is he talking about? You said the firm was having its best quarter ever. You told me the yacht in Saint-Tropez was a done deal for next summer." "Shut up, Arthur," Richard growled, though his voice lacked its usual commanding boom. It sounded thin, reedy, and desperate. "It's a temporary liquidity crunch. We are perfectly fine. Don't listen to this hack, Chloe." Arthur laughed, a sharp booming sound that cut through the polite murmurs of their corner. "A liquidity crunch. Richard, you over-leveraged client capital on a vaporware biotech firm that's currently under investigation by the FDA. Your chief financial officer spent the entire afternoon panic-calling mezzanine lenders trying to secure a bridge loan, and every single one of them said no. And now that Victoria has so graciously illuminated the situation for the Duke of Valois, well, the jig is up, old boy." Chloe's phone slowly lowered to the table. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating her meticulously curated bubble. She had attached herself to Richard Crawford because he was a titan, a walking black card who could elevate her from the grim reality of bottle service to the VIP rooms of the global elite. She had tolerated his age, his arrogance, and his condescension because of the unshakable security his wealth provided. The realization that she was sitting next to a sinking ship and wearing a dress that was currently being mocked by billionaires snapped something inside her. "Are you broke?" Chloe asked. Her voice wasn't whiny anymore. It was cold, sharp, and brutally pragmatic. "I am not broke." Richard slammed his fist onto the table, causing the crystal glasses to rattle and drawing furious glares from the neighboring tables. "I am Richard Crawford. I manage billions. I will fix this. By tomorrow afternoon, this will all be handled." "You're ruined," Chloe said, her eyes widening as she connected the dots. She looked toward the stage where Victoria was currently standing, bathed in a brilliant spotlight, looking like an absolute sovereign. "She set you up. Your ex-wife brought you here to humiliate you, and you fell for it, and you dragged me into it." "Keep your voice down," Richard hissed, reaching out to grab her wrist. Chloe snatched her arm away as if he were radioactive. "Don't touch me. You think I'm going to stay here and be a laughingstock? Do you see how these people are looking at me? I'm trending on Twitter right now." "Richard, someone just posted a photo of me calling me a discount flamingo. You told me this gala was going to make me an icon. You're making a scene." Richard begged, the sweat now visibly beading on his forehead. "I'm leaving," Chloe declared. She grabbed her sparkly clutch and stood up so abruptly that her chair tipped over backward, crashing onto the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. The entire back quadrant of the ballroom went dead silent. Hundreds of heads swiveled toward table 84. "Chloe, sit down!" Richard pleaded, his voice cracking. He was completely unspooled. "Have fun paying the SEC, Richard." Chloe spat loud enough for the entire waitstaff to hear. She turned on her impossibly high stiletto heels and stormed away, her neon feathers bouncing as she practically ran toward the exit, pushing past a tray of champagne flutes and leaving a trail of absolute chaos in her wake. Richard sat frozen in the silence. He was entirely alone. Arthur Pendleton took out a small notepad, jotted something down, and offered Richard a sympathetic yet utterly cruel grimace. "Well," Arthur whispered, That's certainly going in the morning edition. Suddenly, a resonant, crystal-clear chime rang through the ballroom. The heavy gold-trimmed velvet curtains on the main stage parted, and the orchestra swelled into a triumphant crescendo. The spotlights merged into a single blinding pillar of illumination in the center of the stage. Victoria walked out to the podium. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was the silence of deep, unadulterated reverence. Victoria adjusted the microphone, her midnight blue velvet gown, absorbing the glare, the Cartier diamonds at her throat catching the light and refracting it like a prism. She looked out over the sea of the world's most powerful people, and her gaze slowly, inevitably drifted to the dark corner where Richard sat completely alone. Distinguished guests, your Royal Highness's friends. Victoria began, her voice carrying an impossible warmth that masked the steel beneath it. Tonight is about legacy. It is about recognizing that true power is not found in accumulation, but in architecture. It is about tearing down the decayed, fraudulent structures of the past and building something enduring in their place. The crowd murmured in agreement. The Duke of Valois nodded approvingly from table 1. When I took over as executive director of the Sovereign Winter Gala, I promised transparency. I promised that this evening would represent a shift in how capital meets philanthropy. Victoria continued, her eyes never leaving Richard's. And so it is my profound honor to announce that Lumiere and Partners has officially secured a $200 million philanthropic commitment from the Bourbon Sovereign Trust to rebuild educational infrastructure across developing nations. The ballroom erupted into thunderous standing applause. Billionaires and royalty alike rose to their feet. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. $200 million. It was exactly the amount of capital he had begged the Duke for earlier that evening. Victoria hadn't just sabotaged his pitch. She had already secured the money for her own empire. She had won the game before Richard even realized they were playing. "Thank you," Victoria said over the applause, offering a regal, sweeping bow. As she straightened up, she looked directly into the camera broadcasting to the large screens flanking the room. And to those who find themselves suddenly navigating turbulent waters, tonight, remember this: the house always wins when you're the one who built the foundation. Enjoy the rest of your evening. The orchestra launched into a lively waltz. The guests began to mingle high on the thrill of the monumental announcement. But at table 84, Richard Crawford sat entirely perfectly still, a ghost trapped in the machine he used to own. The sun rose over Manhattan the next morning, with an indifferent, blistering brightness piercing the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard's Tribeca penthouse. The apartment, usually pristine and echoing with the soft hum of central air, was in a state of violent disarray. Richard had staggered home from the plaza at 2 a.m., completely intoxicated, only to find the penthouse door wide open. Chloe hadn't just packed her bags. She had pillaged the apartment with the efficiency of a seasoned mercenary. Every piece of jewelry he had ever bought her was gone. The vintage Rolex collection he kept in his study, gone. Even the original Picasso sketch he had bought at Sotheby's, which Victoria had told him was a terrible investment, had been ripped from its frame. He had spent the remaining hours of the night sitting on the floor of his empty master bedroom, clutching a bottle of scotch, watching the hands of his wall clock inch towards 6 a.m. At exactly 6:01 a.m., his phone vibrated. It was a Google News alert, then another, then 50 more. Richard's bloodshot eyes struggled to focus on the glaring screen. There, on the digital front page of the Wall Street Journal, was a headline that read like an obituary. "The Fall of Crawford Capital. How a $400 million cover-up was exposed at the Sovereign Gala." The article, penned by Arthur Pendleton, was a masterpiece of investigative butchery. It detailed every failure, every over-leveraged bet, and every desperate illegal maneuver Richard had made over the last 6 months. But what made the article a cultural phenomenon, what made it instantly viral across Twitter, LinkedIn, and Bloomberg terminals worldwide, was the brutal recounting of the gala itself. Arthur had painted a Shakespearean portrait of an arrogant titan publicly dismantled by the brilliant ousted wife who had built him. There was a high-resolution photo embedded in the article, Richard sweating and panicked, staring up at Victoria on the grand staircase of the plaza, while Chloe stood next to him, looking like a discarded party favor. The market reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. By 7:30 a.m., when Richard finally dragged himself into a town car and rushed to the Crawford Wealth Management skyscraper in Midtown, the damage was already terminal. The lobby was swarming with aggressive financial reporters and paparazzi. He had to be escorted through the underground loading dock by building security. His suit wrinkled his face pale and unshaven. When he reached the executive floor, the silence was terrifying. The trading floor wasn't buzzing with the usual arrogant energy. Brokers were quietly packing their personal belongings into cardboard boxes. Phones were ringing off the hook, but no one was answering them. Richard sprinted to the glass-walled boardroom. The heavy oak doors were closed. He pushed them open, ready to scream orders, ready to perform a miracle. Sitting around the massive mahogany table was the entire board of directors. At the head of the table sat Harrison Cole, the fiercely conservative old money chairman of the board who had been Richard's mentor. Harrison didn't look up when Richard burst in. He was slowly signing a stack of legal documents. Harrison. Richard gasped, his chest heaving. Listen to me. The WSJ article is a hit piece. I can contain this. We freeze redemptions, we issue a press release citing a temporary restructuring, and we pivot the narrative. Harrison Cole finally set his pen down. He looked at Richard with a mixture of disgust and profound weariness. There is no narrative to pivot, Richard. Harrison said, his voice echoing coldly in the cavernous room. We received 75 withdrawal notices from our largest limited partners between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. The fund is insolvent. Furthermore, the SEC field office contacted our legal department 20 minutes ago. They are launching an emergency audit based on Pendleton's allegations of fraudulent reporting. I am the CEO. Richard roared, slamming his hands onto the table. I built this firm. You were the CEO. Harrison corrected smoothly. The board convened at 5 a.m. We have voted unanimously for your immediate termination with cause. You're being stripped of your equity, your severance package is voided due to the gross negligence clauses in your contract, and corporate security is waiting outside to escort you from the premises. You no longer have access to this building, these accounts, or our clients. Richard staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. You can't do this. I made you all billions. No, Richard. Harrison sighed, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. Victoria made us billions. You were just the face on the brochure. And now that she's pulled the curtain back, we see there's nothing left inside. Hand your keycard to security on your way out. 30 minutes later, Richard Crawford stood on the bustling sidewalk of 6th Avenue, holding a small cardboard box containing a crystal paperweight and a framed photo of himself on a yacht. The winter wind whipped around him, chilling him to the bone. He pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He opened his contacts. He scrolled past Chloe's name. Her number was already disconnected. He stopped at the contact simply labeled Victoria. He hit dial. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Hello. Her voice was crisp, bright, and utterly calm. In the background, Richard could hear the faint clinking of fine china and the soft murmur of classical music. Victoria. Richard choked out a single pathetic tear, cutting through the grime on his face. Please, they took everything. The board fired me. The SEC is calling. I have nothing left. You won. You proved your point. Please call Harrison. Tell him you'll help me fix this. I know you can fix this. You always fix this. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a fleeting, desperate second, Richard thought he heard hesitation. He thought he heard the ghost of the woman who had spent 10 years protecting him. Richard, Victoria said softly. Yes, he replied, holding his breath. I'm afraid you have the wrong number, she whispered. The woman who used to fix your mistakes died a year ago at Le Bernardin. I'm just the host of the party. Click. 3 miles away in the sun-drenched, sprawling penthouse office of Lumiere and Partners overlooking Central Park, Victoria. Hayes set her phone face down on her antique mahogany desk. She took a slow, deep breath, the scent of fresh white orchids filling the room. She picked up her cup of black coffee, walked to the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, and looked out over the Manhattan skyline. The city stretched out before her, a glittering labyrinth of glass and steel. It was a vicious, unforgiving kingdom built on the bones of the weak and the arrogant. But as the morning light caught the brilliant sharp edge of the Cartier diamond still resting on her collarbone, Victoria smiled. It was a beautiful day to rule. If you love this story of ultimate revenge, high society drama, and a woman taking back her empire, hit that like button right now. Do not forget to share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that the best revenge is massive success. Have you ever turned a crushing heartbreak into a spectacular comeback? Let me know your story in the comments down below. Please make sure that you subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another incredible tale of wealth power and scandalous twists. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye for now.